you feel like the federal government's a little bit out of control? Okay, a lot. I saw 2 hands, right? Okay. You know, when I teach all across the country, some people try to say, well, KrisAnne, you just teach the choir. Well, I'm sorry, the choir needs to be teaching too, needs to be taught too. I mean, how many of you learned a bunch yesterday? Right? These are things that we were never taught. But I don't just teach the choir. As a matter of fact, now that Donald Trump is president, there's a whole new audience of people who are interested in knowing the Constitution. And I think that's great because the Constitution itself is not a political thing. It's an American thing. And I love taking advantage of teaching all kinds of people from all different walks of life and all different ideologies. But as I teach across America, and it doesn't matter the political spectrum, everybody that I meet all agree that the federal government is out of control. Now everybody has a different reason why, right? But nonetheless, the conclusion is exactly the same. So what do you think the most asked question I get from people as I teach? How do we fix it, right? How do we fix this? Well, here's the crazy thing. If we'd been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 150 years, we wouldn't have that question. Because the means by which we fix an out-of-control federal government are the same mechanisms that were put in place in 1789. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed in America is this. We have been taught the wrong things about our Constitution. We've been taught the wrong things about our government for so very, very long. And until we start educating ourselves on what is the proper role of the federal government and what are the proper checks and balances, I'm afraid to tell you some bad news because nothing's going to change. You see, you can vote in a new congressman every other year, but nothing will change if we do not understand the limit of Congress as a whole. You can elect a new president every 4 years, and nothing will change if we keep expecting a president to do things they're not authorized to do. On my radio show this year, last year, I used to have a daily show, but then the traveling and the teaching and the Liberty First University just got to be too much doing a show every day, so now I do them on Saturdays. But when I was doing the daily show during the presidential election, what I did was I took some presidential candidates every day, and I did a comparison of their political platforms, their presidential platforms. You know, the things that they have published on their websites. Now here's the interesting thing. I didn't do what most media sources do. I didn't compare the candidates amongst themselves. I compared them to the only standard that is relevant, the Constitution. And I think I did 7 presidential candidates. And I'm going to tell you, there's not a single one of them that had a constitutional platform. Not a single one. And I sort of started scratching my head because we're talking about the Constitution Party. We're talking about the Libertarian candidate, those that you would think were probably the constitutionally minded ones, the Republican candidates who are the party of the Constitution by the words of their platform. Not a single solitary one with a constitutional platform. And it made me ask the question, why? And I started looking, and the thing was, all of their platforms said the same thing. You see, everybody is asking the president to do things. And each platform was an answer to the questions that Americans have. Will you raise or lower taxes? Will you fund the military? Will you protect the environment? Will you fix the budget? And so all these platforms are the answer to these popular questions that people get. And they're the same questions you see in the presidential debates. And it occurred to me, there's not a single solitary presidential candidate that is constitutional, because the American people are not constitutionally minded. We are asking the president to do things he's not supposed to do. And if we had a presidential candidate that was actually constitutional, I fear that person would never get elected. Hi, my name is KrisAnne, and I'm running for president. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to raise or lower taxes, because as the executive branch, that's not my authority. As a matter of fact, constitutionally speaking, I don't even have the authority to sign a budget. A budget is under complete control of the House of Representatives in Congress. Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 says that the House of Representatives alone is in charge of the budget, that the Senate may offer amendments, but even if the amendments are not approved by the House budget is the budget for America by the Constitution. I am not going to deploy troops. I don't have the authority to deploy troops. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to be declaring any wars. That's not under my authority either. It's not my authority to regulate the environment, so we're going to be phasing out the EPA. The executive branch of the federal government as a whole has no authority whatsoever to regulate the firearms in America, so we're going to be shutting the ATF down too. We're going to send all these people back to your states and allow you to employ them on the state level so that the regulation happens where it's supposed to happen. How long will a presidential candidate like that last in America? It's because we don't think like constitutionally minded people anymore. As a matter of fact, when you know history, our presidential elections make our presidents look more like kings than leaders of an executive branch. The judiciary is so far removed from the constitutional body it was designed to be. We now treat the judiciary as if they are an oligarchy of 9 kings and queens. Think about this. How many of you have heard on the news, or politicians, or even your educators in the schools? Where are my students out there? Raise your hand, students. High, loud, and high, and be proud, right? Many of you have heard your teachers or your professors say, the Supreme Court ruled the other day. Right? It rolls off the tongue. Every newspaper article, the ruling by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled. Here's the thing. Courts don't make rulings. Kings make rulings. Courts issue opinions. And their opinions are only binding in 2 circumstances. A court's opinion is only binding on the people involved in the case. And that court opinion is only binding on the people involved in the case if that opinion is consistent with the Constitution. Because you see, even the Supreme Court must submit to the terms of the Constitution. Let me ask you this, how many of you heard this? Well, you know, what can we do? Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. Have you heard that? Roe v. Wade is not the law of the land. It's a Supreme Court opinion. It is not law. It was never legislated by Congress, and even if it were, it would be an unlawful act by Congress because we have never delegated to Congress the authority to define life. And for the Supreme Court to issue an opinion that Americans treat as if it has the weight of law is a violation of separation of powers, a per se violation of the Constitution. And James Madison himself, knowing history and repeating other philosophers, said that when power is consolidated into one branch and separation of powers is violated, then liberty cannot survive. Some of you just figured out that the federal government's way more out of control than you originally thought. Well, here's the good news. We don't have to wait around for Congress to fix things, because it's never going to happen. I mean, a hog does not clean its own pen, right? And you can change out the hogs and elect 452 new ones, and they're still going to wallow in it. You don't have to wait for the president to fix things. You don't want him to, because for him to fix what's wrong with Washington, D.C., he's got to become king. And the Supreme Court's never going to do anything about it. They are now too addicted to power and the benefits of their power. So like, well, KrisAnne, now the checks and balances, what are we going to do when they all fail? Well, they haven't all failed, because we've still one check and balance. As a matter of fact, not just one, the greatest check and balance on the federal government that we have yet to begun to really employ. And no, I'm not talking about picking up arms. I'm talking about the check of the states on the power of the federal government. Inherent in the creation of our constitutional republic, our founders created a federal government that was to be inferior to the states, so that the states were the greatest check and balance on federal power. And that's what we're going to do here today. I am going to teach you today, not by my opinion, not by musings or divination. I'm going to teach you by history and by the words of the men who wrote the document themselves, why the federal government is inferior to the states in defining its power, and why the states are the greatest and most powerful check and balance on maintaining a limited and defined federal government. Now, in order to do this, we have to get back to some essential basics. And when I mean basics, I mean ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Now, I don't know if it's because it's cold outside and we're getting toasty and warm in here today, but you guys are way too quiet for me. And I'll make a deal with you. I won't make everybody move forward to the first 3 rows if you promise me that you'll participate vocally. Everybody agree? I want audience participation, because I'm going to tell you what. Right now, and the classes that we taught yesterday were great. They're motivating, they're educational, they're necessary. But right now, this class is probably the most important thing that I teach. Because this class teaches you, each of you, each individual you, the things that you can do tomorrow to start making things right. So when we get back to the basics, I want everybody to answer out loud. These are going to be very simple questions. And I warn you, because they're so simple, you're going to think they're trick questions. I'm going to promise you, no trick questions, okay? So feel confident and answer out loud. We're going to practice right now. So everybody on the count of 3 is going to say amen. Can we do that? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Amen. Amen. All right, now that was a practice. Now let's do it for real. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Amen. Oh, did you hear how loud that was? I want you to be that confident, because I'm not only going to show you how to fix things, but in the meantime, we're going to figure out that the Constitution is not complicated. It is not difficult to understand. It was actually written so that the average layman in 1789 walking the street could pick up the Constitution and know how its government was supposed to work and the obligation of the people to keep it working that way. 1789, they had no internet, no Google Oracle, no MSNBC, no Fox News. And the Constitution was written for them. Now, if we're actually smarter than they are, as some want to say, then it should be infinitely easier for us to understand them, wouldn't you think? So we're going to get back to the basics, and the first thing that we are going to address is the origin of the states. Now let me ask you something. Here's our first question. Which came first, the states or the federal government?
States.
I told you it was going to be easy. But you see, if that knowledge moved from here to here, it would be impossible to have the federal government that we have today. Because we know, by even just the simple terms of natural law, who comes first has the most power. But let's see. Because it's not only a first thing, it's a matter of how first. Because there's a big time lag there, and I want to show you how this works. We teach, and oh, there's a clock for me today. Thank you. All right. We teach in our classrooms that our states, that our colonies became independent from Great Britain with the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. How many of you heard that? It's not true. Okay? We did not become independent from Great Britain with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, only one guy signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. That was John Hancock. The rest of the delegates didn't sign it until, well, it wasn't completely signed until the end of August. Our states became independent from Great Britain on July 2nd, 1776, with the ratification of the Lee Resolution. The Lee Resolution was brought forward to the Continental Congress by a delegate from the state of Virginia by the name of Richard Henry Lee. That's why it's called the Lee Resolution. He brought it to the Continental Congress on June 7th, 1776. And on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress debated, voted, and ratified the Lee Resolution into law. I just want that to settle in a second. Our independence from Great Britain wasn't the random act by a bunch of rich elite slave owners who had had too much to drink in a pub one day and decided that they wanted to oppress people and become independent so they could have all the power. I've seen that variation in textbooks, mind you. Our independence from Great Britain was a legally binding legislative act, a law that's just as legally binding as our Congress, anything our Congress does today that's constitutionally based. Lee Resolution has 3 provisions. Step number 1, we are independent from Great Britain. You see, because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their... What's that again? Creator, with certain inalienable rights. Our rights don't come from the king. We are born free, so we do not have to ask permission from the king to be free. We have to simply step up and declare it. Step number 1, we're declaring our freedom by right of God. Step number 2, we must gather for an alliance. Because we do not have the resources or the manpower to kick Great Britain off the land they think is their own. And step number 3, we must immediately form a confederation of states. Why? We have to form a confederation, not a consolidation. Parents, you can teach your children the difference because there's a really important difference there. We are a confederation of states. Why? Because we're about to go into debt to foreign nations to achieve our independence. We're actually even going to have foreign troops on our soil fighting on our side. And if we do not come together as a union of confederated states, then there is no way for us to together secure the liberty that we will achieve through independence. Because then we'd just be picked off one by the very foreign nations that helped us. We cannot believe that France, Spain, and Holland were helping us with our independence just because they were a bunch of nice guys. They wanted something out of this. So we got to assure them that through a confederation, we will put our funds together and pay back these debts, but we will also protect the independence that we will be fighting. So the states came first. They were created July 2nd, 1776, with the ratification of the Lee Resolution. Knowing now that our states became independent states, no longer colonies, on July 2nd, makes us have to admit that the states existed prior to everything. They existed prior to the Declaration of Independence by 2 days. They existed prior to the federal government created through the Articles of Confederation, and they existed prior to the federal government created through our Constitution, which is termed the More Perfect Union. Now let me mention to you, there's 13 years between this date and this date. 13 years where the only consistent operational government are the states. And I want to say it this way. Our states existed successfully 13 years without the federal government that we know today. How many people do you know think that your state could not exist 13 minutes without the federal government today? Why? Because we never teach just exactly how we came about. Now there's an important chronological fact that we must address so we can establish an essential building block. The Articles of Confederation created the first central government. George Washington was not our first president. George Washington is the first president under this Constitution. We actually had 8 presidents under the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation did not work out well, but probably not for the reason that you were taught. So how many of you remember being taught that the Articles of Confederation failed because the creators of that document created a central government that was too small and didn't have enough power? How many of you remember learning that? Okay, that's not true. It's actually the exact opposite. But let me connect it off for you for just a second before we get into these details. If you are taught by a government school, or by something, I don't know, that this document created a central government that was too small and didn't have enough power to do what it was supposed to do, what implication does that make on this document about the new central government? It's bigger and it's more powerful, right? The exact opposite is true. But so many Americans believe that our current federal government is bigger and more powerful than it was when we started. And that was necessary to achieve the goals of the Constitution. So why in heaven's name would we be opposed to an even bigger federal government and an even more powerful federal government? Because that's obviously heading in a better direction, right? I mean, that's consistent with what's taught. But it's wrong. You see, the Articles of Confederation failed not because the government didn't have enough power, because it didn't have enough guidance. The delegates did not know how to properly perform the functions they were supposed to be performing. They didn't understand the limits of federal government. And they were doing things they weren't supposed to do. And the things that they were supposed to do, they were doing them all wrong. When you read the ratification debates, they talk oftentimes about learning from the mistakes through the Articles of Confederation. And you find out that the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation had to do with a power that our federal government still holds today. A power to make treaties. What was happening under the Articles of Confederation is the federal government was making inequitable treaties. They were making treaties with foreign governments in which one state or one set of states had to provide all of the resources or foot the bill, and another state or another completely different set of states got all the benefit. Now the states who were having to carry the weight of the treaty were like, transfer our resources and prosperity to these other states. That's not what general welfare means. So they were refusing, righteously so, refusing to comply with these treaties, which is a huge problem, because a treaty is literally a contract with a foreign government. A foreign government who has no idea that the contract it engaged in was illegal, unconstitutional. And so now we've got a really big problem, because that foreign government doesn't know it's an unlawful treaty. They only see that this new America is violating the agreement of their contract. Not only that, the states who are supposed to be getting all the benefit are ticked off at all the states who aren't going to pay. So we are very literally on the verge of war with foreign governments and on the verge of war between the states. So the Congress said, this is not going to work out. We're going to have to create, we're going to have to call together delegates, we're going to have to elect delegates, we're going to have to fix this. Now the fix comes in the means of replacement. You see, we are no longer operating under the Articles of Confederation, because you can't have competing, coexisting contracts. When a new contract is written, it supersedes the other contract. So what we have to do is dissolve the Articles of Confederation before we create this Constitution. Now that seems to be a bit of a controversial fact, because it isn't very literally in writing. But it doesn't have to be, because it was generally understood. When you have a contract that's no good, you got to replace it. They knew that's exactly what they were doing. But you can show somebody who's a little bit insecure about this, that this is true by one simple fact. How many of you remember in your history or your civics class that there was a precarious moment in our history where we didn't have enough states to ratify, that we're going to agree to ratify this new Constitution? Remember that? And in that debate of not having enough states to ratify this new Constitution, what did they say the consequence would be if this Constitution was not ratified? There'd be no union, right? It was not, we'll fall back on the Articles of Confederation, because after all, they're still going on. It was, if we do not ratify this, there'll be no union, there'll be no central government. There is your chronological proof that there was no federal government in existence at the time of our ratification of our Constitution. So, if we now understand that this federal government is gone, and we're waiting for this federal government to be created, tell me, everybody please, what are the only governments that exist in this little blank space of time?
States.
The states. Now if you're taking notes, this is a very important building block, and I want you to remember that the only governments that existed prior to the ratification of the Constitution were the states. Now we can move on and reestablish in our understanding, what does it mean to be a state? Now that kind of seems silly to say out loud, but let me just preface this with the understanding of human nature, that over time, the definition of words change. How many of you know that, right? For example, if I were to tell you in this class today, we're going to hear from some very famous liberals on how the Constitution is supposed to operate. Some of you might be going, what, KrisAnne? Really? She's really jumped her rocker now. But what if I told you that when the Constitution was written, a liberal was somebody who believed that liberty is a gift from God? When the Constitution was written, George Washington was a liberal. Thomas Jefferson was a liberal. James Madison, Patrick Henry, Alexander Hamilton were all liberals, because that meant they believed that liberty was a gift from God. Sometimes definitions change. Sometimes they just get diluted. For example, if I'm going to tell you I'm here to encourage you today, because I most definitely am. I am here to encourage you. You might get a vision of a cheerleader in your mind, right? Now go look up that word. That word encourage most literally means to infuse with courage. Now before I went to law school, before I went into the Army, I was a biochemist. And I know to infuse something means to saturate it to its very cellular level. So when I tell you that I'm here to encourage you, that's exactly what I mean. I am here to saturate you to the very cellular level with the knowledge necessary to give you the courage to support and defend liberty. It's a little bit more than a cheerleader, right? Well, a state is a little bit more than you likely remember. To understand what it means to be a state, we're going to go to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So if you have a pocket constitution, you can turn to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and follow along. If not, it's going to be up here. I like it when people have constitutions or pocket constitutions with the Declaration in them, because then they can be my fact checker, make sure I'm not changing anything up here, right? But this is the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It comes after all the list of grievances. And I don't know if you remember looking at the Lee resolution from the other slide. But this last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is actually taken from the first clause of the Lee resolution. Now this is July 4th, 1776, that this is going to be published. Is there a federal government? Everybody now. Is there a federal government?
No.
Are you sure? I mean, I need you to be sure about this stuff. Are you sure? It's good to be sure, because you're right. But you've got to have that confidence in your knowledge, because there's going to be people that come at you who will disagree. And then what they'll say is, well, after all, look, it says, we therefore the representatives of the United States of America. How can you claim that the federal government was not in existence when they're talking about the United States of America? And you can simply respond, because the federal government didn't exist, and we know that because grammar matters. You see that U in United? It's not capitalized. United States of America is not a proper noun in that sentence. The only proper noun is States of America. That word united is an adjective to describe the condition of the states being united in their declaration. There is a movement to insert the federal government at this level, because these people that I endearingly call federal supremacists always want to put the federal government and the states on co-equal status. So it says, we, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good king. Is that what it says? The good what? People. Why? Because our rights don't come from the king. We don't need his authority to do this. And what are we doing on July 4th? We are solemnly publishing and declaring. Notice we didn't become independent on July 4th. We published and declared what we had done 2 days prior. What are we publishing and declaring? That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Now in that last statement, we have just learned what a state is not. I mean, we were colonies, and now we're states. Which means a state and a colony are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. So what's the difference between a state and a colony? Very simply, a colony is not free and independent. You see, if you live in a colony, you must seek permission and guidance from your central government before you can use your land. You must seek permission and guidance from the central government before you can manage your resources, before you can educate your people, before you create certain businesses, regulate certain businesses, before you do just about anything. thing. Create certain laws. You have to seek guidance and permission from the central government. Anybody feeling a little bit like Kansas is acting like a colony? Well, here's the good news. Kansas is not a colony. She is a free and independent state. Now, it's not enough to know what a state is not. We must know what a state actually is. Okay. Continuing now with the Declaration of Independence. We are going to learn the definition of a state as told by the people who created the state. That they, these independent states, are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the what? State of what?
Britain.
You see, that word state is not simply synonymous with New Hampshire, Rhode Island, or Virginia. That word state means the same thing as Great Britain, France, and Germany. We created 13 independent, free, and sovereign governments that hold the same power and political authority that Great Britain, France, or Germany holds. I'm going to prove this to you with this document. So, then between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and what? Independent states. Now this is an important part, because if they're independent, we're about to list the power that these free and independent states hold. Now the independent part is important because what it tells us is the list of power is not shared between the states. Each and every state holds the identical list of power. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, or Germany may of right do. And that is the power that Kansas holds today. Now, you will not say this without somebody disagreeing, because the lack of education and the prolific wrong education that we have in America will teach people to say, well, that's the Declaration of Independence. How can you claim that power belongs to Kansas? We know that only belongs to the first 13. What you need to explain is that that is not politically, historically, factually, constitutionally, or even legally accurate. There is a legal doctrine called the equal footing doctrine. And the equal footing doctrine says that every state that enters the Union enters on the same footing as the first 13. So Kansas, there is your footprint. Someone might try to say, well, that might be who Kansas was when you created her as a state. But the moment that you entered into the Union, you surrendered your power. Also, not accurate in any form. The Constitution is very, very clear on this matter. And that clarity comes through the 10th Amendment. Where the 10th Amendment says, who has a pocket constitution with them right now? Stand up.
Yes, ma'am. The power is not delegated.
What?
The power is not delegated.
So what is that word again?
Power.
Next one.
Not.
And?
Delegated.
That word.
To the United States.
Are not what?
Say again.
Those powers that are not what?
Delegated.
Delegated.
To to the United States.
Okay, you can stop now. We're going to go on and just keep it because you're going to go back. Did you hear that? The powers not delegated to the United States. It doesn't say surrender. It says the powers not delegated to the United States. Now let me ask you a very simple question, not a trick question. Are the words delegate and surrender, are they synonymous? Do they mean the same thing? Are you sure? Yes. Completely. All right. Good job. Give yourselves a hand. You now know more than the Supreme Court of the United States. I have read Supreme Court opinions written by the pinnacle of conservative justices who have errantly written that the states surrendered power. Only that's not what the Constitution says. And we're going to learn today that that is a very, very important distinction. Incredibly important distinction. Not only is it not constitutionally accurate, it's politically ridiculous. Let me ask you a question. How many of you are familiar with an independent, sovereign government by the name of Germany? Some of you don't know Germany. Yeah? Didn't Germany join the European Union? Well, let's all fly over to Germany, we'll have a town hall meeting, and we'll just simply calmly explain to the German people and their chancellor that Germany is no longer an independent sovereign government because they joined the European Union. How do you think the German people are going to take that little bit of news?
Not good.
I mean, some of you are laughing, right? Because it's ridiculous. So it kind of begs the question, though, doesn't it? Why do the people of Kansas believe it? Kansas just joined the American Union. Not only that, Kansas was created with greater sovereignty than Germany could ever imagine. You see, Kansas was created under the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Germany was created under the principle that kings give rights. We were created with greater sovereignty, and yet we accept greater servitude. Could it be because we've been teaching the wrong things for a very, very long time? Now don't lose that page. Okay, I'm going to call it again, because this is important. Because now we need to know the nature of the Constitution. We know the timeline. We know the states came 13 years first. We know the states are independent, sovereign governments with the same political authority as any other country in the world. So what is the Constitution? Legally speaking, the Constitution is a contract. It is a legally binding contract, but it's a special kind of contract. It is a contract that we refer to in the legal field as a compact, which is an important distinction. A contract is a legally binding agreement between sovereign people. And when I say sovereign, that means you've achieved the age of legal consent. Can our young people, like our 15-year-olds, can they make a legally binding contract? No, because they've not each reached the age of legal consent. But you see, a compact is not an agreement between legally sovereign people. A compact is an agreement between legally sovereign governments. Are you ready to connect some dots? Remember our timeline. What are the only legally sovereign governments that existed prior to the creation of our Constitution? The states. That means, since the Constitution is a compact, an agreement between legally sovereign governments, and the only legally sovereign governments that existed were the states, that the Constitution has to be an agreement between the states. In the legal field, constitutional law, and the contract law field, we call them the parties to the compact. Now you're even going to get pushback on this Because everywhere you turn, someone is trying to undermine the authority of the states, to undermine the security of the Constitution. And somebody's going to tell you, well, KrisAnne Hall is teaching you about the compact theory. It's just a theory. We don't even know. It's not really a contract. It's not really a compact. It's all a theory. Problem with that statement is, throughout the ratification debates, through the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, and the documents that they wrote after the ratification of the Constitution, all of the drafters of the document refer to the Constitution as compact. How many were here for the religious liberty class yesterday? You remember Richard Henry Lee's quote back then, right? It is true we are not disposed to differ much at present about religion, but as we are creating a constitution for ages and millions yet unborn, he said, why not make the free exercise of religion a part of that national compact? You're also going to hear that from James Madison a little bit later. So here's the thing, and this is just huge. It's not the hugest thing that we're going to do today, but this is just huge. We have determined, not by opinion or divination, but by fact, logic, and deduction, that the states are the parties to the compact, which means the states are the creators of the Constitution. They are the parties to the Constitution. Now somebody's going to try to tell you, well, that's not quite accurate, because after all, we know that we've been teaching this for 150 years, that the Constitution is not an agreement between the states, it's an agreement between the people and the federal government. That is so wrong that it's easy to prove. Let me ask you a question. Was the Constitution ratified by popular vote of the people? Was it? No. Well, the people cannot be a party to the contract if they were not involved in the ratification of the document. Who ratified the Constitution? The states. They are the parties. Someone, our federal supremacist friends will say, what KrisAnne really means is that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government, because they're always trying to make that co-equal standing. Only to say that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government is a temporal impossibility. When did the federal government, and only when did the federal government exist? Once the Constitution was ratified. So by contract law, we call the federal government the product of the contract, because it only existed once the contract became legally binding. Now, you cannot be a party to a contract if you are the product of the contract, because you cannot sign the contract into legal being if you don't exist until it's signed. And Occam's razor says, when you eliminate all possibilities, the only thing that remains must be the truth. And the only thing that remains is that the states are the parties to the contract, and the federal government is the product of the contract. Which leads us to another set of inevitable conclusions. Number one, the states are the creators of the Constitution. The central government is a product of the Constitution, which means the states are the creators of the central government. Right?
Right.
Everybody see how that works? States created the Constitution that created the federal government. Therefore, the states created the federal government. Now, when the states created the federal government, they created a limited central government, and they enumerated its specific powers. And then they did the most important thing they could have ever done. They reserved all other power to themselves. Go ahead and finish reading that 10th Amendment for us.
Where do you want me to start?
At the beginning. And I won't interrupt you.
Is that promise?
No. But you do have to stand up again.
The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people.
You see that? If it's not delegated, it's reserved to the states. The next question we have to answer in our logical deduction here is what power is delegated? Because the 10th Amendment is very clear. The powers that are not delegated belong to the states. So what powers are delegated? Well, it's very interesting that we don't have to file a Supreme Court case to get them to tell us their opinion on the matter, or make a ruling. Because James Madison already told us. Who knows what nickname James Madison bears in history? Say that again louder for us, please. Father of the Constitution. He should have a little bit of authority on its meaning, don't you think? So James Madison writes a document that we refer to as Federalist 45, where he is going to explain to us in the future, but most relevantly to those who are going to be tasked with ratifying the Constitution, the separation of powers between the state and the federal government. He says in Federalist 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. We put them in a box. Those that remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Now, what does that mean? Well, Madison's going to tell us very specifically the powers delegated. He says the powers delegated to the federal government by the proposed Constitution will be exercised principally on external objects. That's how the founders of our Constitution referred to foreign affairs. And then he names them: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. You see, 13 years the states have been working together. 13 years they've been functioning as independent sovereign governments. We don't need the federal government to tell us how to run our states. We need the federal government only if we're going to be a union of states so that we can have a unified voice in foreign affairs. So that if we're making treaties as the United States of America, we don't have to make 50 different treaties with 50 different terms and 50 different currencies. So that every foreign nation will know the terms of naturalization within these United States. Foreign affairs. But I don't know if you're taking notes. War, peace, negotiation, and commerce. Didn't you just see that list of powers somewhere else? Where was the, it's a short portion of the list, but where did we see that list? That's right. The powers that the people delegated to their states. Now let's look at this, because Madison says the powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Well, those powers first rest in the states. So this is probably the biggest thing all day. If the powers first rested in the states and the power is being delegated to the federal government, who is delegating power to the federal government?
States.
I need everybody to say that really loud because this is very important.
States.
States. Delegated. Delegated by the states to the federal government. Not surrender. Delegate. Let's look at what the word delegate means. It is a temporary trust of responsibility or authority by a higher power to a lower power. We have all just recognized that the states delegated power to the federal government, which means that the states have to be the higher power, and the federal government must be the
lower power.
Lower power. Not only that, it is a temporary trust of responsibility, like an employer-employee relationship. A lower power cannot delegate to a higher power because a lower power cannot delegate what it does not possess. And it's, like I said, it's like an employee-employer relationship. What if I start a business all by myself? And my business, I'm going to make hamburgers, fries, and milkshakes. Now, if I were Superwoman, I could do it all by myself, right? Serve all my customers all day long, never need any help. In spite of what you may have heard, I am not Superwoman. Just teasing. You can laugh, that's okay. So I have to hire employees. So I hire somebody to make the burgers, the fries, and the milkshakes. And when I hire them, I am delegating what belongs to me to them under specific terms. What happens if the fry guy comes in one day and says, sorry, I don't feel like making fries? Do I have to hang a sign on the door and say, sorry, my customers, my fry guy doesn't want to make fries, so I guess we're not going to have any fries today? Is that what I have to do? No. What should I do? Fire him, right? I fire him. So he walks out the door, and now I have to hang a sign up and say, you know, customers, I am so sorry. I had to fire my fry guy today, and when he left, he took the fry power with him. Is that how that works?
No.
No, because when I fired him, because he was the lower power, that authority comes back to me. I make the fries, or I hire somebody else to do it. What if the fry guy comes in one day and kicks the burger guy off the grill and says, I ain't making fries, I'm making burgers? Does he have the authority to do that?
No.
No, because that authority was never delegated to him. As the original delegator of that authority, it would be my job to pick up the burger guy off the floor, dust him off, put him back on the grill, and make the fries after I fire the fire guy, right? Madison is telling us the powers that are delegated to the federal government are very limited and defined. They fall under the realm primarily of foreign affairs. War, peace negotiation, and foreign commerce. He goes on to say the power of taxation rests in that foreign commerce realm. The federal government was created by the states to be an employee, an ambassador on behalf of the states to foreign affairs. And that's the only reason the federal government exists. Because Madison is now going to tell us in Federalist 45 what powers are reserved to the states. He says, the powers reserved. Now this is your second really important word in all of this. We already talked about delegated. The second most powerful word in this is reserved. It's also repeated in the 10th Amendment, right? The powers reserved to the several states. Now that word several in this context doesn't mean a few. When they used the word several back then, it meant severed and independent. So the powers that are reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects. Now what does the word all mean? I mean, we have to take time to talk about this and realize we have people in Washington, D.C. who want to redefine the meaning of the word is. And they've completely forgotten the meaning of shall not. So we are clear, all means all, right? To all the objects, which in the ordinary course of affairs, not the rare, not the occasional, but in the ordinary course of affairs, concerns the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state, all reserved to the states. Now think about that. And then think about the federal agencies that exist. like the EPA, the FDA, and the Bureau of Land Management. Is that war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce?
No.
No, but it's very clearly the properties of the people, right? What about the Department of Education, HHS, USDA, and the FDA? Is that war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce?
No.
No. That's the lives of the people, right? What about the FBI, the DHS, the FCC, the SEC, the FAA, and any other three letters you can sling together? Because I don't know if you're aware, there are several hundred executive agencies in America. Is that war, peace, negotiation, foreign affairs? No, all of these things concern the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, and the eternal order and improvement of prosperity of the state. These are powers that are clearly reserved to the states. Now, your federal supremacists may disagree and say, well, that's just James Madison. That's just one man's opinion. No, it is not. Because if you take Federalist 45 into context, you understand that there was a huge, huge opposition to the Constitution and the creation of the federal government in the Union. The states were refused. There were several states, as a matter of fact, more states that they couldn't get 2/3 of the states to ratify, that were refusing to ratify the Constitution because their greatest fear that by joining into this union and creating the central government, that their states would be consumed by other states in power or authority and by an ever-growing, ever-expanding central government. They were afraid by joining the union that their states would lose their sovereign and independent status. The purpose of Federalist 45 was James Madison to prove to these people who are supposed to be delegates, and he wants them to ratify this Constitution. He's proving to them, your states can't lose their sovereignty. They will not be consumed by an overgrowing, ever-expanding federal government, because the federal government can't be overgrowing and ever-expanding because it's limited and defined. And it can't consume states because in reality, the states will hold the majority of the power superior to that of the federal government. And if, this is the most relevant part, if those who were ratifying the Constitution did not believe what Federalist 45 says to be fact, then the Constitution would have never, ever been ratified. Separation of powers that Madison outlines in Federalist 45 was accepted by the delegates who signed it to be the fact on how the Constitution was going to work. So what power is reserved? We know what's delegated, the few and defined, the foreign, but what's reserved? And is there some power sort of floating around in the ether? Well, we know that. It's everything else in the states, so nothing is just floating around. If it's not specifically enumerated, then it is a power reserved to the states. Now, why is the power specifically, why is that word reserved used? Because reserved is a very important word. Reserved means to exercise dominion over a thing to the exclusion of everybody else. Let's think about this. If there's a chair up on this stage and there's a sign on it that says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, if someone else sits in that chair, what do I have the right to do? Kick him out, right? Because the chair is reserved. I have dominion over this chair. It's a property ownership to the exclusion of everybody else. Now, if the chair says reserved to KrisAnne Hall and someone else sits in that chair and I don't have the right to kick them out, is the chair really reserved? No. The designers of our Constitution to protect the sovereignty of the state wanted us to be sure that the states understood and the federal government was on notice that this power is reserved. It is the property of the states. Can Illinois come to Kansas and tell Kansas how to run its state?
No.
No, because in the matter of state Kansas affairs, Illinois is a foreign government. Can Germany come tell Kansas how to run its state?
No.
No, because in the political realm, Germany is a foreign government to Kansas. And the same understanding existed with the central government. The central government cannot come into the state and tell the state how to run its internal affairs. As far as reserved powers are concerned, the federal government is a foreign government in the states. And that has to be true. It has to be. Because if it's not a reserved ownership by the states, and the states don't have the right to tell the federal government, no, you can't control our education. No, you can't control our health care. No, you can't control our environment. No, you can't control our commerce inside. If they don't have the right to say no, then you must admit that the Constitution is a lie and James Madison is a liar because the powers are not actually reserved to the states. And because they are reserved, the states have an absolute duty to say no in protection of that power. But if they're not reserved, then they're open to anyone. Illinois, Germany, and the federal government alike. If they are not reserved, then there is absolutely no limit to the federal government's power. Because if the federal government can go to our states and say, I think we'll do health care today. I think we'll do education today. I think we'll control your water and your prairie chickens. And if the states do not have the undeniable authority to just say no, then we have to admit that the federal government is the limit of its own power. That they can just decide whatever it is that they want to do. And if the states must agree to whatever claim of power the federal government asserts, whether it's delegated or reserved, are the states sovereign? No. Our states are returned to their original status of colonies. Now, if the states are not sovereign, what happens to the Constitution itself? Because the Constitution is a compact, which is a legally binding agreement between sovereign governments. And if the states are not sovereign, that means it's like your 15-year-old making a contract. And the states have now made an illegal agreement that's not legally binding, which means the Constitution itself is dissolved, which means that the only means by which the federal government exists is its own will and authority, which makes the federal government a totalitarian kingdom and the states reduced to colonies. Now here's the good news. The states are still sovereign. The contract is legally binding, and the states are still the higher power, and the federal government is still the lower power. And the only thing that needs to change is this. We're the ones who have forgotten, been misled and deceived into believing that we are subjects in the kingdom. So what happens when the federal government is using undelegated power? Thomas Jefferson's going to explain this to us. He says, whenever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Now let me make an analogy for us to help us understand how this works. Tell me what your name is again. Bridget. So we're going to pretend that I've just stolen Bridget's car. And while we're pretending, Bridget has a Maserati. Is that cool? Or should I rather have a Lamborghini? Maserati's good. All right. So I've just stolen Bridget, right? I'm terrible with names. It would have probably left my mind if I hadn't said it twice. So I've just stolen Bridget's Maserati. Do I have the authority to drive her car? No, because the power over her vehicle was never legally delegated to me. Do I have the authority to sell Bridget's car?
Nope.
Absolutely not. If I sell Bridget's car, is it a legally binding sale?
No.
No, because the power over Bridget's Maserati was never legally delegated to me, which makes any act I do with that car unauthoritative, void, and of no force. You see what that is? Thomas Jefferson is explaining to us that when the federal government is exercising power that has not been specifically delegated, it is stealing power from the states. If there's one thing that I could just change about the way that we speak, when the federal government does something that is not authorized by the Constitution, it is not just unconstitutional. It is a crime. Do we not know that the Constitution is referred to as the supreme law of the land? And when you violate the law, that makes you a criminal. You have committed a crime. For the federal government to exercise the authority of education, environment, business regulation, gun regulation, land regulation within the state of Kansas is a criminal act. Now let me ask you something. Because it inevitably comes down to this. What is the solution to that? Does Bridget have to sue me to get her car back? Because this is, your federal supremacy going to say, well, now what you have to do is you got to file a lawsuit and sue the federal government and have the courts agree that that power is reserved to the Kansas. Does Bridget have to sue me to get her car back?
No.
No. She simply asserts the title deed to the vehicle, and the local officials have to return it to her as the legal rightful owner. Do the states have to sue the federal government to get their power back? No. All they have to do is assert the legal title to their power. What is the legal title to their power? The Constitution. Do you know the states suing the federal government to get their car back is like Bridget suing me, or the states suing the federal government to get their power back is like Bridget suing me to get her car back, showing up in court and finding out that the judge and the jury are all my family members. Right? Because the states sue the federal government where? In federal court with judges that are appointed by the federal government. Why should we be shocked and amazed when the federal government sides with itself in a legal case? Not only is it ridiculous, it's dangerous. You see, for the states to sue the federal government to get back what rightfully belongs to them, every state that sues the federal government over stolen power must first admit that the federal government has the authority to determine the limits of its own power. And then when the federal government sides with the federal government, what is the remedy? States must just simply assume their colonial status and lay prostrate before, what is that word? Flat before the king and beg for mercy. That is not the condition that our founders pledged life, fortune, and sacred honor to create. That is the condition that they fled from. So what do the states do? If it's not about suing the federal government, what do? Good news, our designers of the Constitution are going to tell us. James Madison says that in the case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted, the states have the right to interpose. Now that word interpose is similar to the word eclipse. It means that the states, because the power is reserved to them, it's their property, they have the right to step up in between the exercise of unlawful power by the federal government to the protection of the rights and liberties of the people. They have the right to take the keys back and say no. But if you're following along on the slides, you notice that I skipped over some stuff. Because Madison not only says that the states have a right to do that, and we know that's based on the nature of the power being reserved, but he says they have a duty. They are duty-bound to interpose. Your state is duty-bound to step up to the federal government and say, your EPA has no jurisdiction here. We can manage our own environment in the state of Kansas. We don't need you. Duty-bound. Why are they duty-bound? Well, let's go back to the creation of the states through the Declaration of Independence, because it tells us why that's duty. They said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the government. The only reason we created the states, the only reason states even exist, is for the single sole purpose of securing our rights. And if our states fail to keep the federal government in its limited box, they allow the federal government to become this ever-growing, ever-expanding totalitarian kingdom, then our rights are not secure. And our states are failing to accomplish the only reason for their existence. And then you gotta ask yourselves, why do you even have a state? Why do you have state government? Why do you have local government if that's all they're gonna do? Become hirelings and minions for the federal government. Just dissolve it all and go to the kingdom format. Because frankly speaking, politically speaking, kingdoms are a very simple form of government. You have those in charge, and you have everybody else. And everybody else goes along with those in charge until those in charge do something that makes everybody else mad. And then they chop off heads. There's no elections, no political process, no debate, no obligation of the people to be involved in government whatsoever. But they created for us a constitutional republic, so we would be involved, and our children would not have to cut off heads. So how do states interpose? Interposition is the what? How do they interpose? Nullification is the how. Thomas Jefferson says the several states who form the Constitution being what? And? Don't forget the independent part. Because there are some federal supremacists who sort of sit on the fence and they say, well, of course Kansas can oppose what the federal government is doing in its state, but only if 36 other states agree with Kansas. If we have to wait on 36, if we have to wait on one state to agree with you, are you sovereign? Are you independent? No. Because Kansas does not have an obligation to the people of Illinois. Kansas has an obligation to the citizens of Kansas, and that's it. He says that these 7 sovereign and independent states have the unquestionable right to judge when the constitutional compact is being broken. That's what it means by its infraction. Why? Because the states are the creators of the compact. Surely the creators of the compact are the designers of the compact, and they are the dictators dictators of the meaning of the compact. In contract law, we call that the meeting of the minds. It is the number one first step rule in understanding the terms and condition of a contract. It's not what the judge says. The number one first step in determining the contract's meaning and application is those who wrote it. He says, those sovereignties have the right to nullification as the rightful remedy. What is nullification? Nullification is very clearly the states exercising their sovereignty. It is the states standing up and defending what has been rightfully reserved to them when the federal government is stealing power, unlawfully breaking the Constitution. Now, your federal supremacist friends don't like the word nullification. They want you to believe that nullification is the rejection of all government and permission to use violence against government agents. That is not what nullification is. Nullification is the peaceful check and balance, so you don't have to be a kingdom and reject the government. So what do we do about this? Can the Supreme Court tell the states they can't nullify federal law? Because your federal supremacist friend has now kicked in gear. Oh, I knew you were going to get to nullification sooner or later. You just have been duped. Do you know that the Supreme Court has decided that the states cannot nullify federal law? I mean, the Supreme Court, well, they're the ultimate arbiters of what the Constitution means, you know. And since they know what the Constitution means and they tell us what the Constitution means, then we know that the states cannot nullify. That is so wrong. And James Madison says it so clearly that it makes me wonder how we can repeat these lies so often by such educated people. I often wonder if our educational elite can actually read. Because the directions given to us by the drafters of the Constitution are so very clear. Look at what he says. Can the Supreme Court tell the states they can't nullify federal law? Madison says, if the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the sovereign parties to the Constitution. Who are the sovereign parties to the Constitution? So let's read it like that. If the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the states, dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by other departments, but the judicial department also may exercise or sanction dangerous powers beyond the grant of the Constitution. Consequently, the ultimate right of the parties to the Constitution, who are states, the ultimate right of the states to judge whether the compact has been dangerously violated must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as by the legislative or executive. Madison is reminding us of some very important things. Number one, the states created the Constitution. Number two, the Constitution created the federal government. When the states, through the Constitution, created the federal government, how many branches of government did they create? 3. Madison refers them to departments. Legislative, executive, and judicial. The Constitution created the judiciary, which means the only power the judiciary holds is the power that has been delegated to it. And who delegated the power to the judiciary? Which means the states are the higher power and the judiciary is the lower power. Not only that, the judiciary is part of the federal government. If part of the federal government can determine the power of the federal government, then what is the not a constitutional republic. That is a totalitarian kingdom. Now Madison, during the ratification debates of the Bill of Rights, is going to explain to us now the greatest check and balance on the federal government. He says, besides this security, now he's talked about other securities of the federal government, one of them being the judiciary. He says the judiciary will be an important check and balance on the executive and legislative branches. He never says an important check and balance on the states. He says, besides this important security of the judiciary as a check on the legislative and the executive, there is a great probability that the rights of the people will be secured. Why? Because the state legislators will jealously and closely watch the operations of this government. Why will the state legislators jealously and closely be watching the federal government? Because they're sovereign and because they are duty-bound, right? Because they are duty-bound to guard and protect the rights that are reserved to them, the property bestowed upon them by the people. That's why. So that the minute the federal government steps outside of their box, they're immediately stepping on the power of the states. That's why the legislators will jealously and closely watch so that won't happen. But look at what he says. He says these state legislators will be able to resist with more effect every assumption of power than any other power on earth can do. They are the greatest superheroes in the defense of the rights of the people. He says, and the greatest opponent to a federal government admit the state legislators to be the sure guardians of the people's liberty. Our state and local governments are supposed to be the greatest opponents to the federal government, not their best friend co-workers and on the same payroll. And that is the ultimate check and balance. Our state and local governments saying, no, that power has no authority here. It is no law at all. Therefore, we will not comply. Look at what Jefferson says about the judiciary. He says, the great object of my fear is the federal judiciary, that body like gravity ever acting with noiseless foot and unalarming advance, gaining ground step by step, and in holding what it gains. He's talking about the trend that we see today of the legal elites turning precedent into something superior to the Constitution itself. Opinion greater than the Constitution. He says, it's engulfing insidiously the special governments into the jaws of that which feeds them. He says, our government will become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated. Now, Mark talked about this, the supremacy clause, when he was talking before we got up here. Your federal supremacist friend will try to tell you, KrisAnne's full of baloney because, the federal, everybody knows. They always say that. Everybody knows the supremacy clause declares that the federal government is superior to the state's constitution and the state's laws. How many of you heard that? People who say that have either never read the supremacy clause themselves or they are illiterate. Because it is a very, very simple clause within the Constitution to understand. As a matter of fact, Alexander Hamilton describes the purpose of the Supremacy Clause in one sentence. Now, this whole paragraph is about the purpose and the consequence of denying that purpose. But the purpose in one sentence is this: no legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. That's not a paraphrase. That's exactly out of Federalist 83. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. And that's what the Supremacy Clause says. Look at it. How many of you remember diagramming sentences in school? Oh, you guys are groaning. Did anybody like it? Thank you. I did too. I did. I'm like a dot connector. I like things organized into boxes. It helps me understand things. So don't be afraid, but we're going to diagram this sentence just very, very basically, okay? Just about conjunctions and stuff like that, okay? So what we have is a compound sentence that is separated by a comma and a conjunction, which means what we really have are two independent statements that have been blended into one. Now, when we take these two independent statements in their independent status, it really helps us see the difference. This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Nothing else has to happen. Because it's the Constitution, it is supreme. However, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. You see, the laws and regulations made by Congress and the executive agencies are only the supreme law of the land when they are made consistent with the Constitution. When they are made pursuant to the delegated authority. That's what Hamilton was saying. It was Federal 78. There you go. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. If these acts of the federal government are not made in pursuance to the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton explained to us that they are no law at all. Is the EPA, the federal EPA, made in pursuance to the Constitution?
No.
Well, according to Alexander Hamilton, which, by the way, was the biggest government guy of his day, which pales in comparison to big government people today, right? He's probably considered a conservative Republican, you know, but he's a big government guy of their day. According to the big government guy of his day, the EPA is invalid and no law at all. Does the federal government have the authority to regulate your firearms?
No.
No. As a matter of fact, they are expressly forbidden. Which means the ATF and its regulations are no law at all. So let me ask you something very, very important. What obligation do the people of Kansas have to obey something that has absolutely no legal authority whatsoever? Only this one. Only the one that we impose upon ourselves. Inevitably, somebody's going to say, well, if we tell the federal government no, they'll march in here with troops. No, they won't. Are they marching into California? Colorado? New Mexico? No. How about Elkhart, Indiana? Did you see the troops marching into Elkhart, Indiana when the sheriff of Elkhart, Indiana kicked the USDA and the FDA out of his county? He got so sick and tired of the USDA and the FDA raiding his Amish farmers over their weapons of mass destruction. You know, raw egg, milk, and cheese. Then he wrote the USDA a letter instructing them to share the letter with their, quote, FDA friends. That if those federal agents step foot into his county ever again without first stopping by and getting his permission, that their agents would be spending time in his jail. That is what we call a constitutional sheriff who said, your authority has no jurisdiction here. That was years ago. And guess what? Brad Rogers, sheriff of Elkhart, Indiana, is still sheriff of Elkhart, Indiana. And guess what? He has never had a problem with the USDA, the FDA, and there have never been troops in that county. Because you see, nullification is constitutional. Your federal supremacist friend will try to tell you, you know what? I challenge you. Search the Constitution. Find nullification. You see, because you're not going to find the word nullification in the Constitution. Therefore, the states cannot nullify. Well, I'm going to tell you, nullification is not in the Constitution. But to the contrary of your federal supremacist friend, that's actually Because we know, as we read the 10th Amendment, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, are what? Reserved to the states and to the people. So if nullification is not in the Constitution, that has to mean it's not a power that's delegated, right? Which we must conclude then, it must be a power that is what? Reserved to the states. What does the Supreme Court say today about nullification? Well, it might surprise you, because I'm hearing some scoffing out there. How many of you know this guy?
Oh.
That is John Roberts. He is the Supreme Court, Chief Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, you may remember an opinion that he wrote on the Affordable Care Act. In that opinion, he said that the Affordable Care Act was not a tax, it was not a penalty, it was a tax. Everybody remember that? In that opinion, he also said this. In the typical case, not the rare, not the occasional, in the typical case, we, meaning Supreme Court, look to the states to defend their prerogatives. That means their reserved powers. By adopting the simple expedient of not yielding. That is the definition of nullification. You have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States that has said, in the ordinary, typical case, we expect the states to nullify federal laws. Why? Because the states are separate and independent sovereigns. And sometimes they have to act like it. Now, I will differ with Mr. Roberts in that one. You see, you can't sometimes be sovereign. Being sovereign is like being pregnant. You're never a little sovereign, you're never a little pregnant. It's either all or nothing. And the minute you are not sovereign, you're not sovereign. Can you believe the Supreme Court of the United States, the Chief Justice, believes that nullification is the rightful remedy? Is it lawful for the states to refuse to follow federal laws that are not constitutionally consistent? Because right now, if your federal supremacist friend has made it this far in the conversation with you, you're freaking out. You cannot possibly tell me that you believe that states can nullify federal laws and just disobey the law. If that's the case, then nobody will know what's lawful. There'll be anarchy throughout the Union, and there'll be no law and order. That's what they're going to say. I know, I've heard it. Nullification is not the states acting unlawfully. Nullification is enforcing the supreme law of the land when the federal government is breaking the law. There is lawful nullification, there is unlawful nullification. Let's just be clear about this, because a state cannot nullify a law that is made in pursuance to the Constitution. They made that contractual agreement. Sanctuary cities are an exercise of unlawful nullification because we delegated to the federal government by the Constitution the authority to make uniform rules of naturalization. And to refuse to enforce those uniform rules and to prohibit the federal government from enforcing those federal rules is a violation of their contractual agreement with every other state. It's an unlawful act. On the contrary, we have never delegated to the federal government the authority to regulate our plans. We have never delegated to the federal government the authority to regulate what we eat, what we drink, what we smoke, what we consume. So states who are nullifying federal marijuana laws are engaging in legal nullification. This is not a statement using drugs. This is a statement about state authority, because the power is not delegated, it is a power reserved to the state. Kansas, you don't want marijuana to be legal, it is your sovereign authority to say so. But it is also the sovereign authority for Colorado to say the other way. And it is an unlawful criminal act for the federal government to assert its authority within the state on powers that are not delegated. And in our conservative crowds, that's where we mess up. We want to permit the federal government to do things it's not entitled to do because we want them to do it. And then we scratch our heads and get all worked up when they're doing something we don't want them to do that's contrary to the Constitution. We point our fingers and call them unconstitutional. You can't have it both ways. The contract is binding on its terms, period. We have to remember, if the federal government is not defined by the Constitution, then why in heaven's name do we even have something in writing? Why didn't we just create a federal government and let them do what they wanted until we didn't want them to do it anymore, and then we picked up the rod of iron? If the federal government is not limited in its power by the Constitution, then what is the limit to the federal government's power? You know what? Thomas Jefferson asked the same question. He says, when all government, foreign and domestic, in little as in great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another. Notice he didn't say one branch on another, one department on another. He said one government on another. What government is supposed to be checking the federal government? We know that because of the next statement. He says, if the states look with apathy on this silent descent of their government into the gulf which is to swallow all. Isn't that a beautiful euphemism for Washington, D.C.? The gulf which is to swallow all. He says, we have only to weep over a human character formed uncontrollable but by a rod of iron. Because if the states and the local governments fail in their duty to nullify unconstitutional federal acts, illegal federal acts, then what those state and local governments are declaring is that you are a subject in a kingdom, and that is only controlled by a rod of iron. So how do we start? Here's your how-to. You got to defend the Constitution. We have a motto at Liberty First University: liberty over security, principle over party, and truth over personality. You have to be willing to do what's right because it's right, whether it's politically advantageous or popular. You have to be liberty over security. We need state and local legislation asserting the state's reserved powers. Now let me be technical about this. You don't need legislation. But we have taught the wrong things for so long. I think state and local legislation is the only thing that will give our politicians the backbone to do what's right. We need state and local legislation denying unauthorized federal power. And in addition to that, and probably more important than that, we need a sheriff, state and local officials who are willing to stand in defense of the rights and the liberties of the people. That's what Kansas lacks. See, you did number 1 and number 2. When you passed the Firearms Protection Act, which declared that the federal government had no authority within the state of Kansas for firearms and accessories that are manufactured in Kansas, sold in Kansas, and bought by Kansas residents. Your governor and your legislators signed that into law. But when Jeremy Kettler, a military war veteran, bought a suppressor, not a silencer, a suppressor from a Kansas dealer that was manufactured in Kansas, and Kettler, being a Kansas citizen, in compliance with Kansas law, the federal government came and prosecuted him for violation of federal gun laws. And the legislators stood silent. And the governor did nothing. And your attorney general threw you under the bus. And the sheriff protected no one. As a matter of fact, now that Kansas legislators, your governor, and your attorney general all admitted that this law was made, and then refused to protect the Kansas residents from the federal government in violation of Kansas law, the law that they did create, 30-second rule, the law that they created becomes a criminal act by your state government. A criminal act of entrapment. Because Jeremy Kettler believed he was following the law. He never ever believed he was doing anything wrong. Because your governor and your legislator and your attorney general told him he wasn't. They entrapped Jeremy Kettler to break a law and then did not defend him in it. That is criminal. Because the bottom line is this. Your state and local governments will do a lot of things if you don't get involved. They'll keep going along and getting along. But they will never do what's right, and they will never do what you want them to do unless you make them do it. Which means the principle of the check and balance of the state and local government on the federal government must begin with every individual in this room. Every individual in this room must know why they cannot obey a federal law that's contrary to the Constitution, and they must demand and expect their state and local governments to agree and protect them. And that is the only way this will ever change. You will not change this with any single or multiple federal elections. This can only change at the state and local level. Only. And my advice to you, if the world were perfect according to KrisAnne Hall, the American people would ignore every federal election for the next 6 years. And we would devote all our money, all our time, and all our resources in getting a constitutionally minded school board, a constitutionally minded city council, a constitutionally minded county commission, and then they could have a constitutionally minded sheriff, and a constitutionally minded state legislature, a constitutionally minded attorney general, governor, and agricultural commissioner. And then, frankly, you won't care what kind of crazy things the federal government's doing. Because you will be a sovereign state. And history says Kansas will know a prosperity they cannot even imagine. You break free from the chains and bonds of federal supremacy, and Kansas can be the most prosperous state in the Union. Without a doubt. And all it takes is one person to make it so. You want to change your lives overnight? You can do it in one election. You get a constitutional sheriff like Brad Rogers, and he will protect you from everything that the federal government is doing. There'll be no IRS warrantless searches, no DHS, no FBI, no warrantless searches, no seizures, no civil asset forfeitures, no robber barons in your county. Your whole world can change overnight with one election, and a sheriff is the easiest election to win because nobody pays attention to them anymore. They don't understand the power that a sheriff has. This is the solution of the designers of our constitutional republic. This is what they expected us to do. How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been here today. How many of you would like to have your state capital taught this lesson? Well, guess what? I've taught it twice to them now. You wouldn't know it though, would you? Why? Because I can teach them all day and twice on Sunday, but if the people in their constituencies do not know this, they won't do what's right. They won't do what's right because it won't matter. Your county commissioners need this class. Your city council needs this class. Your sheriff needs this class. That's where it's important first. How many of you, let me ask you something. If we've been teaching this for the last 60 years, how different would America be?
Oh my.
How different would Kansas be? Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties, nor be easily subdued, when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, "But on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders." We have lost more liberty in America from the Gulf, which is to swallow all, than we have or ever will from any foreign terrorist. The book that I have back there, Sovereign Duty, teaches this class. It also teaches a class on the constitutional sheriff, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to be secure in your property. We also teach nullification in a greater detail, and we talk about Article 5 conventions. All mechanisms of the sovereign state. And if you were not able to take all the notes that you wanted to take today, this book will give you the opportunity to not only have what I taught today, but also have all my research. We not only have the Sovereign Duty book, but we also have a class at Liberty First University, a course at Liberty First University on state sovereignty on DVD at the back table. Colton can help you with that. And you can then share this course with your friends, your family members, city councilmen, county commissioners, with your sheriff, and start spreading the seed of independence again. We have all these resources available to you, Liberty First University. Right now, we're running a special deal at Liberty First University. If you sign up now, you get a free 5 days free trial of Liberty First University. If you decide that you don't like it, all you have to do is cancel. If you do decide you like it, then you just have to keep studying. Self-paced, online, with textbooks that you can write, or you can download and print out. Don't you think our children need to learn this? I mean, think about it. If we raised up an entire generation with this understanding, they could make the America we're supposed to have. Thank you, Mark. Where are you? There you are, for bringing me here again today. Thank you, Pastor, for opening the doors for us. And I want to thank you for coming and braving the negative temperatures and all that nasty stuff out there. I do want to sort of drop in there the comment. I'm from Florida, so it feels a whole lot colder for me than it does for you. So thank you very much. Remember, you can get in touch with us if you have classes that you want us to teach. Remember, we have no speaking fees, so all you have to do is contact us, and we'll do our best to get you on the schedule as soon as possible. Thank you very much. God bless you.